Welcome back to the European VC podcast, everyone. As you know, Europe does not have a deep tech problem, but we do have a commercialization problem. The last European companies to reach 100 billion plus are SAP and ASML, but they're both 40 to 50 years old. If you want the next generation of deep tech champions, capital alone won't get us there. We need our customers to pitch in. Today's conversation is about that missing piece, how European deep tech actually wins enterprise buyers at scale. Martin Schilling sits down with us to talk about the intersection between startups and corporates. He spent years studying why Europe funds breakthroughs but fails to industrialize them, and what needs to change on both sides to unlock real demand. Welcome to the podcast, Martin.
Hey, Andreas. Thank you for having me.
So I tried to summarize a bit what we're going to talk about here today. Did I get it somewhat right?
Perfectly. You're spot on as always.
So Martin, let everyone know exactly what your background is, how you got into deep tech, and think it's so important to pour your efforts into this.
Yeah, sure. Hey, look, I have both a builder and an investor background. So I was COO of N26. So I had the pleasure to scale a really exciting fintech story in a very transformative time. So I know how build unicorns. At the same time, as well, investor, I've invested in 80 B2B SaaS and deep tech startups as part of my work at Techstars. I'm currently bringing this all together with the deep tech momentum.
Beautiful. Talk a bit about deep tech momentum, just so because I've actually mentioned it to quite a few, and there have been many that say, you keep saying this deep tech momentum, Andreas. What is that?
Hey, look, the starting point is here, Europe's tech sovereignty. We in Europe have a beautiful 1,000-year-long innovation history in deep tech. I think Archimedes, Da Vinci, Lovelace, Copernicus, James Watt, and the many other European innovators. We are now, however, at a point where the fate of Europe is not decided in Europe anymore. So think what happened a couple of weeks ago. Some European nations sent a couple of dozen soldiers to Greenland, and the next day we are threatened with tariffs. So this is just one sign that we need to work on our sovereignty. We are building DTM, Deep Tech Momentum, as Europe's leading deep tech innovation marketplace. That's the thought. It's essentially an innovation marketplace. We're doing live events, and we're doing with a tech platform. We have a financing arm, and there are two fundamental objectives. One is we want to trigger 100 billion additional capital into European deep tech, and the second relates to your starting on this podcast, 10,000 additional enterprise contracts between large companies and deep tech startups.
Yeah, let's actually dive deeper on that to start with, because you're really pinpointing that the commercialization part is the bottleneck. We've got a lot of strong initiatives, both from the business side and the political side when it comes to funding deep tech, but we definitely do have a bit of a problem when it comes to commercialization.
Yes, exactly. Hey, deep tech is exciting because in Europe, we are beautifully positioned on this. So we have always historically not been good in creating tech to upload funny cat videos on the internet. This is not our strength. Deep tech research is our strength. It's about building rockets, quantum computers. It's about tech, bio, robotics, you name it. There's a very strong research base. And I think what is really hopeful in the last years, Europe has increasingly succeeded in spinning this out from universities. But what is missing is exactly what literally you're saying. How do we now take these companies to scale? By finding more customers for them. Okay, it's not only money. Yes, money is missing, but as well customers are missing. And that's the commercialization part, which is highly relevant.
Maybe you can, because you've done quite a bit of data on this as part of your work with Deep Momentum, maybe you can pull out some of the stats that surprise most of the people you talk to.
Yeah. Hey, look, the first one, you mentioned this at the beginning. The top 10 European companies, according to market capitalization, their average age is 87. Yeah. In the US, what would you say? Top 10 companies, according to market capitalization, average age, what's your guess?
Yeah, well, they're from the start 2000s.
Yeah, exactly. So it's around 30, 34. Yeah. And this difference, when you think about a person here, right? The one are young professionals, the other are pensioners. Yeah. This just translates into activity and commercial activity with startups. A company that has been founded 25, 30 years ago still has the startup DNA in it. So it's easier to collaborate externally with other startups. a company that has been founded hundreds of years ago, and literally I think the fourth youngest companies under the top 10 in Europe is already over 100 years old. Yet it's just, of course, every scandal adds a new protection layer, bureaucracy comes on top. It's far more difficult to collaborate externally. And this is a key missing piece in Europe, that these companies, the large corporates, need to collaborate more with deep tech startups. Another stat I think really interesting, the top 500, Fortune 500 company in the US, in the last 5 years, they bought around, in average, 3 to 4 startups. In Europe is 1 to 2. Yeah, they literally bought double the amount of startups. And this is an exit channel that redistributes money into the ecosystem. It's very helpful. Silicon Valley companies, completely different level. They've bought 12 to 14 companies in the last 5 years. Yeah? And again, there are these stories that in former days, Steve Jobs were just driving around Silicon Valley, just stopping by a startup saying, hey, this is really interesting. I would just buy this tech for the iPhone. And that's the attitude that helps a deep tech ecosystem.
Yeah, and at least if you listen to the grapevine in the US, we're going to see a big comeback when it comes to acquisitions, given the what they call the reign of Lina Khan is gone. So we better get our act moving as quick as we can here. You have another really striking stat, which is that US acquires more than 70% of European deep tech companies and life science. So this is, of course, an aggregate dollar value. Maybe you can talk a bit about that and what you've seen and how you're approaching that.
This essentially means Europe funds breakthroughs and others industrialize them. Yeah, so we are increasingly good in early stage, and there is as well some funding going into this. But if it comes to exits, US buys it and other larger nations. So this is not a new phenomenon, and we know this for several years, but it's still there. So and you have this you have large corporates. Often they look first, even if it's European ones, the first look to the US or to Israel to buy companies, not in Europe. Yeah, so there is an element of as well. European large companies needs to buy Europe. Buying can mean acquire a startup, but as well, of course, be customers. And this is not only things that corporates need to change. Of course, there's a certain quality and maturity of a startup ecosystem. Of course, we all, and that's why you're doing such a great work, we need to level up the European startup ecosystem, making the companies stronger, faster growing, and they need to be at eyes level with the world, and then it's easier to collaborate and acquire them.
It's interesting because a lot of what you're saying here, and that's of course also why I was excited to bring you on the podcast and our general partnership. We are doing our own movement into corporate land because we're seeing exactly what you're describing here, that we have a flourishing tech scene in Europe when it comes to the early stages. We have so many new VCs coming out. Everyone is realizing that European space is deep tech, industrialization, and so on. And for that reason, we're seeing a lot move into the deep tech space as an investment sector. But it just does not work if we don't get the corporate side to also work. They actually make up about 25% of the capital in the ecosystem. So for that reason, when it comes to investment ecosystem, but it's just that too often we're seeing corporate units being closed down when it comes to doing CVC activities. We're seeing too many founders that honestly don't know exactly how to engage with corporates and ensure that they don't break their neck on that. And similarly on the corporate side, because there's a lot of problems on that side as well, and I think it's probably more there than on the founder side that we have issues, where they are just not acting in the way that you have to act to collaborate with founders.
Yeah, and look, Andreas, I would say this is everybody needs to level up, okay? As well on the startup side, there are many things that we need to improve to make it easier for corporates to collaborate with us. Yeah, so this is about as well thinking from the perspective of a customer. There are different processes, we can talk about this a bit later, maybe in this podcast, how as a startup, what you need to do. But I always like to think in ecosystems, and there's often not one player who needs to do things different. Usually everybody needs to level up. Hey, there's another thought which I've found very, very important. There is a new class of champions being built. Yeah, so you see this in the defense sector. In defense sector, you call the large defense companies like Rheinmetall, MBDA, BAE Systems primes. Yeah, these are system integrators. They buy technology and then put them together like a plane. Yeah, they buy technology, put the plane together, and sell the plane then to the public sector. You call the new ones like Helsing, Destinos, and all the others. you call them neoprimes. Okay, this is literally a new type of large-scale company that is currently built in these years. And my sincere hope is that these new champions, the new SAPs, the new ASMLs of this decade, will as well fill the gap. They not only just build commercial traction into their large customer, but as well partner and acquire startups to get there.
Martin, maybe you can comment, and I don't know the N26 journey enough to absolutely be sure that this might be the case, but maybe you can talk about N26 as a partner for startups and as an aggressive player in the market, so to say, compared to the corporate banks, the good old ones that you were competing with.
Yeah. Hey, look, it's a good example. We at N26 as well, we seeing ourselves as, to a certain degree, a system integrator. Yeah, so there's an app, and you can use N26, of course, as your bank, but we did not build the infrastructure all ourselves. There were other startups, other scale-ups where we bought, for example, the core banking system. Was delivered by Mambu. It's classical. It's another unicorn, another fintech, an infrastructure layer fintech that had us build this. Yeah, so the more you can do with these new players as a scale-up, the more you had the ecosystem, you drive this forward. So indeed, N26 was a good case. And I very much hope that many of these scale-ups think even more in these ecosystem collaborations.
Martin, I love having someone like you moving from operator land in startup world to then doing events, because it means that you bring a completely different perspective than many of the conferences that I think we have today, that many of them are born out of an ecosystem mentality, which it's all good to have an ecosystem mentality, but if you don't have a rooted in yourself a builder mentality, first and foremost, I think you end up getting beholden to empire building with your conference. I think that's super important. Let me ask you about, then go back to the corporate perspective. What is it that we're doing wrong? What is it that you're seeing holding us back? I know you have 4 problems that you think are really important that corporates start solving for.
So when we now think about on the corporate side, this whole idea of external AI and deep tech startup collaboration needs to be CEO owned. Yeah, so it's not CTO owned or owned by a venture client team or R&D unit. The CEO of the company needs to have this on top of his or her agenda. This is extremely important. It needs to come from the top. And the time where a corporate is just getting some inspiration from startup is over. On both sides, doesn't work and doesn't help. This is the time of forging partnerships that have direct P&L impact. Yeah, so if you're a startup, you want to sell or collaborate with a corporate, you need to prove that you have bottom line impact. Yeah? And this is a CEO topic. If I can literally push agenda and collaborations with a direct P&L impact within ideally 9 to 12 months, that's helpful. Yeah, and what does it mean, P&L impact? Either you open up a new revenue stream for a corporate or you save costs. Yeah, that's usually the 2 key things you need to do. So that's 1. 2, there is a trust issue. Yeah, I was in Davos 2 weeks ago on exactly that topic on a roundtable, and the key theme in the room of the corporate decision maker was, hey, how can I trust startups? Maybe they are gone in a year. I need to run through procurement processes 9 months, and maybe then they are gone. Or maybe the product doesn't work. Yeah, maybe these guys are not really serious. They are so young. Okay, these are all these trust topics. So there is a trust issue. Then 3rd, there's a capability topic. There is a trend in Europe which is called venture clienting. So more and more corporates build in-house capabilities to actually do these external startup collaborations, which is powerful. There are a lot of consultancies working with corporates, which we totally support. It's great. But there is still, in particular in smaller companies, there is a capability topic. And then finally, relates a bit to the first one, you need to prove that you have P&L impact. Okay, this is really extremely important. You as a founder, a startup, you need to think and pitch very clearly how that's even percentage of revenues I can create in addition, that percentage of cost I can cut. There's a super clear P&L oriented business impact.
Let's dive deeper into each of them. AI adoption must be a CEO-owned, or now startup collaboration must be CEO-owned. Tell me, how do you think about that specifically, and how do you work with a corporate? Because I know that you are, of course, in contact with a bunch of CEOs that are in the deep tech space and trying to figure this out. What do you say to them when you're trying to get CEOs and the corporates working with this as a CEO topic?
Yeah. Hey, so we as DTM have a specific contribution and many others can have others. So what we are trying is to bring CEOs closer to the tech ecosystem and seeing the impact the tech ecosystem can have on their companies. So we have a good example with the CEO of Aumovio, Philipp von Hirschheitel. Interesting case. Continental has created an own spin-off, which they call Aumovio, which they launched last year. We had the CEO of this company at DTM last year. He went on stage, gave a great talk, then went in a confidential roundtable with 10 founders where he met a couple of specific cases selected for the companies. Then there was a large summit where he met some ministers and CEO colleagues, and then he left. And literally said at the entrance when he left, he told me, hey, this was amazing. I've not experienced this before. We'll do more in the tech ecosystem. Yeah.
Let me just double click on one thing there that you're saying. And I think that is so important. And I'm seeing conferences get this wrong again and again and again. It's by them being over focused on bringing a ton of people, but not necessarily catering in a super specialized manner to the most important. And this is the perfect example. You got to do white glove if you want to bring a CEO from a very important company. And then you got to give them a full day's program. That's exactly what they need. And they got to go out from that program and being, this is incredible. I keep seeing conferences thinking they can invite this top VC and I want to get him on stage. And then I'm like, well, what should he do the rest of the day? Well, it's a great conference. We've got a ton of startups. Like, I don't think that's going to cut it, my friend.
Yeah, exactly. Andreas, you're very right. Hey, look, what we are building is not a conference business, okay? We don't think conference or events. We think innovation marketplace, okay? We think here in marketplaces, and these are live, but this is about digital. And the key thing to understand is you need to go buyers first. Okay, it took us actually a couple of years to really understand this, but you need to have in a marketplace buyers on site, and then the sellers will come. Yeah, this is fundamental important. So buyers in this case are corporates. Yeah, so literally what we just talked about, and Aumovio is a perfect customer. Let's call them customers for deep tech startups. If you have these customers on site, the startups will come, and then the investors are more the cherry on the top. Investors totally love this because they want as well to talk to customers. It's good for their portfolio, and then they see very good startups. But it starts with buyers.
Yeah, I do agree, and it's funny to see how we've seen every single tech conference move towards. I always describe it as they started as a startup conference, and that's where they put all their energy. Then it turned into being really the focus of the core staff is really on nailing the investor side. And then now it seems like we've gotten to the point where every conference has nailed, okay, how to get VCs. And now what they're focusing on is getting all the LPs. So you keep moving up the ladder, so to say, up the ecosystem. And I think that many are missing the corporate piece. And I think you're absolutely right that the way to solve for this is not by thinking of your product being the conference. Rather, that's the convening time. But throughout the year, you've got a ton of activities that all come together on this conference day. Am I right in saying that that's how you think about it a bit?
Yeah, and hey, look, we try to think impact, not process. Okay, so when I think this from a startup perspective, what does a founder need? A deep tech founder, two things: money and customers. Okay, that's the key thing you need. You can literally, if you have these two things, you can work around literally almost everything else, even talent, right? Enough money, you buy the talent. And what we are trying to cater to these needs. Yes, of course, when you come to DTM, you'll meet the best deep tech investors of the continent and their LPs, and as well those who can write 50 million plus tickets. Yes, of course. But in addition, you need to have you'll have 1 to 2 days where you can meet 20 potential customers and sign ideally 5 contracts. Right? That's how we think about it.
And that is exactly why so when we decided now we want to move into corporate land, how do we approach that? It came not purely internally. It also came because I had a good friend who was working in this space, and Jeppe Hoyer. And what we discussed in the beginning was, is this a standalone thing or is this together with EUVC? And it became so clear that the problem is not getting corporates to be more in their own jungle and talk about the corporate stuff. No, it's matching VCs, founders, and corporates. And I think that is exactly the point that you're making here. It couldn't be more important.
So there are some themes, macro themes, which matter for Europe on this. We need to build trust along industry value chains. Okay, so we have not one language, not one market still like the US. Europe is more fragmented. We need to put more effort in building trust, in particular now in the age of AI, where authenticity and in-person becomes, again, premium. Building trust along industry value chains is a key thought. So what we are doing, what we're trying is, there are, when you think about a quantum value chain, quantum computing value chain, there is a hardware, there is a software piece, and there are customers like banks or even railroad companies. So we're trying to put on stage an industry value chain and on the conference and then digitally, because building this trust layer is in Europe so important. And this is why this both on-site events, but as well the year-round engagement in a specific community is so helpful for Europe.
Can you talk about the trust element from the corporate side? If a corporate wants to engage more with the startup space, do more corporate clienting, do more startup collaborations, maybe even launch a CVC at some point, how do they start building trust?
Yeah, hey, I would say again, it starts from the top. So if you don't have a C-level who puts this on the agenda, it's very difficult for the organization to do this bottom up. The unfortunate development which we have seen the last years is then that many corporates reverted back to the core. You see this in particular in the automotive space, for example. It's no longer, hey, let's look for next horizon technology, external collaborations. No, we need to get the core competitive. While this is to a certain degree understandable, I would, as a CEO myself, always think this in ends. Okay, so yes, of course, we need to make the core more competitive. And we need to look at the next horizon technologies and look external. Yeah, it's because the key argument for doing this is innovation speed. The clock cycle of innovation is just too slow in Europe. We just clearly see this compared to China or the US. And speeding up this innovation cycle it can only be a CEO topic. Yeah. And then there is a bridge to trust. There's an interesting initiative coming. Gregor Gimi, he is the father of the venture clienting, movement, I would say, in Europe. He's currently building a foundation for certificates as a non-profit thing. So where you literally, as a startup, get some literally proof points, and a corporate, you can see, hey, look, they have been certified. That might be a bit German thinking, I have to admit. But this idea of that literally, let's build some more closed door networks or some certifications, some literally trust signaling ways is one way of building trust with corporates.
I have two observations on trust. One is, it's funny if you look at A16 SAT and what do they talk about when they are talking about what is A16 SAT, what is the purpose of a VC. What they tend to say, or one of their talking points is at least, we are lending trust, we are lending brand to our founders. That's one of our core items, one of the core value points that we bring. And that can only be done, and here's the kicker, because everyone knows the first part, that can only be done if you have trust with the other side. And I think that that's where a lot of VCs in Europe have not built the necessary relationships to the corporate side to be able to lend trust into the corporates. And I think that, if I'm being very honest, I think that that's also where there's a bit of a difference between the native deep tech funds versus a generalist fund that's moving into deep tech. It's one thing to build up investment capacity in deep tech. It's another thing to also build up the relationships to be able to do trusted introductions and so on.
Yeah, what you're saying is that the VCs can play here another role, right? So what you're saying is, if you're building up a portfolio of companies that really work as well, build products with P&L impact, so you choose the right ones, this alone can signal trust to corporates.
My next point was, and this is a bit of a psychology 101, but trust starts with yourself. It doesn't start with you and someone else necessarily. Of course, if the other side has violated trust, okay, then there's something between you, but there's definitely something internally as well. And that goes for any company as well, that there are processes and ways that we do things that can actually either build trust or allow you to trust or hinder it. It's worthwhile thinking that building trust with the startup ecosystem is not just about meeting them more and being out there more and starting building relationships. It's just as much looking inward and saying, what are we doing, or what processes, what requirements do we have that is hindering us from building trust and trusting on the other side?
Yes, exactly. Hey, and the one key metric a founder would look is speed from first conversation to cash in the bank. Yeah, so this is always, and from a corporate side, you always need to understand this. speed and time matters so much for startups and founders. These people think in days and weeks, not months and years. Yeah? But of course, you need to literally from both sides let you have build a bridge and have some understanding. I wish that indeed many more corporates bring systems in place, and we're coming probably again to the CEO agenda, that allow them to be fast. Okay, so we're just hearing this again. I met a very good materials founder who will very likely build a unicorn in the next 2 years. He just, when he talks with US corporates, they just have a system in place that allows them to be fast. So a relatively junior colleague at Google has a budget to just deploy and the decision power to just launch POCs and collaborations. If you're putting a system in place where you need to do several approval layers, committees, etc., it just delays. Yeah. So this idea of being fast and as well fail fast and then learn on this is just something which is so helpful for founders.
And another point here is, of course, that you're also very quickly becoming a very important stakeholder to that founder, which means that most founders building in deep tech know that it's a difficult journey. And for that reason, someone who's really moving fast with you can end up being a quite meaningful influence on where you develop. Not to say that it's good advice to a founder to be too beholden to one customer, but from the corporate perspective, there's a lot of positives to derive from being a very important customer to it.
Yeah, totally. And again, it's as well there is always this message as well to us in the builders world. So you need to prove as well fast that you can deliver P&L impact. That's the counter flow of trust. Yeah. So the trust increases if you deliver the impact to the corporate so that they become more competitive. Yeah. So I would always talk to corporates as founders. I'll help you boost your competitiveness.
One of the things you mentioned was also the third one, capabilities beat technology. Could you just expand on that one?
This is exactly what we're just talking about. So essentially, is there a budget in place for a venture clienting unit to deploy POCs within 2 weeks? That is a capability. Speed to POC is one. Second, is there a process in place, or in particular the mindset? If I'm running a POC as a corporate, I want then to turn this into adoption. Yeah, so I want to give the founders of the startups a multi-annual contract, and I want my business unit to really take this and integrate this in the core. One step even back, is there at all a team in place that is dedicated to external innovation? We have seen a couple of innovation units spun up in the last years, but as well we see a lot of dismantling. And then as well, I've worked with a couple of them. There is a bit of innovation theater, we all have to admit too. Yeah, so literally people from corporates running around and talking a bit, doing some smaller stuff, but without real impact. These days are completely over. Yeah, you need to talk fast with the business unit. You need to integrate the deep tech products in the core of the corporates and not to some innovation, ideas and theaters. So there's a whole suite of capabilities.
And if Jeppe, my dear corporate co-founder, was here on the podcast, what he would say is the average lifetime of a CVC is 3.7 years.
Yeah,
which
exactly.
means that you really have a lot to solve there. So imagine it takes you 2 years to set up the CVC unit, and then once it's set up, you only have 3.7 years to live.
Yeah, exactly.
That, it of course coincides perfectly also with the average tenure of a CEO, which brings us back to your very first point, which is exactly that this needs to be on the CEO agenda. Otherwise, it's going to get killed at some point.
Totally. And hey, look, there are various ways of in building this commercial and the competitiveness impact for a corporate. You can invest. Sometimes it's really the right way to do, but you don't have to. You can become customer, work with a startup, and then acquire a startup. It's totally fine without investing. So I think there are various paths of doing this. There's a whole suite of tools you can use. I would say as well, having a corporate on your cap table, if it works and they give you strategic access to their customer base, can be an advantage. There have been times where this was not at all recommended to do, having a CVC in a cap table. I as well would say that the days are over. One needs to do this carefully, and it depends case by case. But I know, for example, in the fintech world, that if a large bank invests in you, other banks often see this as a signal of trust. Yeah, so as well, I would be, as a founder, open to CVC investments. It, again, is a case-by-case decision, but...
Yeah, but if I should say a really quick note there, so it's never based on the startup case that you cannot do it. It is based on the CVC. Most CVCs, at least any that has high repute, will know that they need to navigate that role as an investor versus a customer and partner very carefully. And also, of course, as a potential acquirer. And that is something that any CVC knows exactly how to talk about. They have processes in place. All the VCs that should come in as co-investors or follow-on investors will be looking at that and saying, what's going on here? Do we have any, are we beholden to a corporate that's come in early and so on? And for that reason, I'd say that it's never a no-go to go CVC, but it's very much definitely make sure that you're talking to people that know what they're doing.
100%. Yeah. And I would always, having a tier one VC in your cap table, kind of the sparkling the best of Europe and the world is of course great, and you should always try to get them. But as you say, if there is a fitting CVC with a good team and access to customer base, it can be a very good addition.
Yeah, I would, if any founders are thinking about this, I would say do go and check out our EUVC corporate series as well. There's a lot of learnings there. We are targeting primarily the corporate side. So there's a bit of jargon that you got to jump over, and some of it might not apply as well. But for founders, there is definitely, if you listen with the right perspective, there are a lot of learnings to tease out. Let me ask you now about the startup perspective. So Martin, you've written a book that is inspired in title by a good companion of mine in on many journeys, and that is, of course, Douglas Adams, because your guide is called The Builder's Guide to the Tech Galaxy. Can you talk a bit about how startups win enterprise customers?
Yeah, exactly. Hey, look, this was very fun to write. I did this a couple of years ago. Literally, these are my learnings from my N26 journey, where I wish I had this exact book before I started. So I've just written the book after the journey. And there's a chapter on B2B sales. So there's a couple of things which, as founders, you should do or not. Yeah. So literally, maybe we can go through a couple of traps if you want and how to avoid them.
I love it. I love traps.
Okay. So the first, when we're talking, B2B sales, yeah, so it's mostly enterprise sales. The first trap is literally just not tracking the right sales KPIs. And there's one really important lesson which I learned while building the last company. Again, it's relatively easy on the KPI level to define outputs. Yeah. So in the sales world, this is revenue booked per person. Yeah, it's pipeline you build, pipeline coverage. These are typical output KPIs. What's fundamentally important is to understand the input KPIs to get to this output. Yeah, often in the startup world, we do not understand enough the inputs to get to the outputs, and then you need to measure the inputs. Yeah, it's a surprisingly simple yet often under-leveraged idea. In the sales world, one of these input KPIs is proposals sent per person per week. Yeah, so if you're building a sales team, you want to see how many proposals you send out per person per week. Yeah, and then more top of funnel outreaches. Yeah, you need a certain number of outreaches and calls to get to proposals. So this is the input logic, and then you come to revenue booked per person and pipeline coverage. Pipeline coverage is a KPI where it just says if you have a sales target of 1 million next quarter, you need to have 3x or 4x of pipeline this quarter to get there next quarter. Yeah. So if you have a sales target of 1 million next quarter, you should ideally have 3 to 4 million in your pipeline. And measuring this ratio, this so-called pipeline coverage, is a key output KPI.
I could talk forever about sales. I think sales is so interesting. Tell me a bit about, because we will have a lot of founders tuning into this as well, and deep tech is a newer space, and it's different from B2B SaaS, where all of our good playbooks have been written by famed VCs and founders. Now, founders are trying to navigate, what can I apply, what can I not apply? Do you have any guidance there in terms of both resources you can go to? We're, of course, trying to build it up on EUVC because we're seeing that this is so incredibly needed. Rockets from the Contrarian team are doing a lot when it comes to the climate space. Where do you go to? Where do you advise founders to turn to when it comes to trying to figure all this out? Because what you just described worked super well at N26. It's definitely also similar to what I've heard in the traditional VC space. But does it carry over perfectly to a deep tech space?
Yeah, interesting, Andreas. It's a very good question. Maybe we together need to write the next book on this one. So you're literally asking, where are resources for deep tech B2B sales, right? Expertise. We haven't discovered yet, but we will search for it and maybe put something in the show notes, because as well, the space is relatively new. And so I would say there are certain B2B sales practices, and we can go through them now, which totally apply for deep tech too. Okay, there are some definitely basics which you need to cover, but then there are some additional points. So deep tech is not deep tech. Okay, this depends on your vertical: space, defense, robotics, quantum, tech bio, all different areas with some nuances to this. But what is clear, if the state is your customer, and this often is this, at least I would say 50% in deep tech, that's the case, then you need to invest more time in branding and engaging the political sphere. Yeah, this is often new for founders. And this means, I know, for example, the space founders who sell as well to defense, you just need to walk to embassies and talk with military attaches about your product. Yeah, you need to go to as well to conferences and events and connect with these people. You need to associate yourself with some associations, and literally you shape the discussion on the capabilities needed so that the public sector then buys your product. So for example, in defense, there are at least 3 layers you need to play. So you need to engage the political spheres. So there is committees, defense and security committees in every national parliament. So you need to go to some evening events, kind of meet these people so that they understand what you're doing. Yes, that's one level. Second level is the MOD and the armed forces together. So the Ministry of Defense and the armed forces, they specifically shape the capabilities that they want to procure. So you need to engage the armed forces, talk to them about their products. Literally, this is what we are doing. We're setting up events where you can do this. And then the third thing is the procurement agency. So you need to as well understand the technicalities when proposals need to be sent. Yeah. So there is a whole customer development and sales muscle you need to build, which starts from almost a year before a procurement contract is being written, where you engage, and then literally how you write the proposal.
Yeah, it is a daunting task. I have a very close friend of mine who's co-founder and a CSO for a defense startup, and luckily he comes from the defense space himself, so he was former military. But otherwise, like, it would be impossible to get into that.
Exactly. This is you're totally right. So you need for this, if as soon as you have a bit of more money, you need to hire people who come from the space. But these are often former generals, great ways, or former ministries of parliament who have been in the defense space. These people are extremely relevant. There as well some agencies that can help, but you need to create a peer-to-peer discussion. And if you are not, as a founder, not from the space, you need to employ people who are from this.
Yeah. We've put out an episode quite a while ago by now, I think, with the Arch Robotics team, and the learning is the same. The founders are from the military, and he says very clearly, Stefan, I think it was, said very clearly that there's no way you're going to get any sales through this machine if you're not military.
Yeah, exactly. There are some shortcuts, however. So you don't always have to sell to the public sector directly. You can as well sell to a prime, then sells to public sector. Okay, so as a founder, I think this is very important to think about different routes now for getting to the next step, and then you can always literally expand your product offering. But from a defense perspective, when you think about sales, you would possibly target a prime too, and as well dual use the civil sector, right? So this is about more the strategic thoughts where your customers are.
I'm just bringing a service message to anyone who has felt that this episode has been a bit of Martin and Andreas talking about how we're trying to approach all of this, but it was truly not mentioned. It was not thought of as such. But we are both so passionate about this and trying to solve this chasm that there is between corporates and startups and VCs, and for that reason, we've kind of ended up talking a lot about our own book, and sorry for that for those that may have felt that this is a bit self-congratulatory and diving deep on how we're doing things.
But as well, I think we're mission-driven, right? We're solving a problem with what we're doing, right? So that's why it comes naturally. And there's one more aspect to this. You need to shape publicly the discussion around your product. Yeah. So as a founder of a certain defense technology or space technology, you want to be in the press or on any kind of public platforms, like it's probably now again, the EUVC, for example, to talk about this, because you want to shape the discussion so that people have your product and even better, the underlying need, capability in mind when then they shape their procurement processes.
Yeah. I think, again, if you go back to the A16 set point that I made earlier, if you ask, I heard Mark Andreessen say this 6 months ago or so on a podcast, it was a bit of a side mention, but he said our biggest team is now policy. I think that really should make people caution and think when they're thinking about building their teams. The biggest VC in the world, their biggest team is now not hiring, it's not talent, it's not marketing, it's not any of this. It's all about affecting policy. And I think that that is something that we need to wake up to in Europe. I think it's something that every founder needs to have top of mind, and I think it's something that every VC needs to have top of mind as well. That said, we can also all get bored with VCs having an opinion on everything. Let me ask you about, and I was about to preface this with my point about us talking about ourselves all the time, but I want to ask you about the DTM Guardian program and your work to get to those 10,000 contracts that you want to help founders sign. Tell me about that, just so that everyone understands how that operates, how they might be able to get involved.
Again, mission-driven. How can we get to at least 10,000 more commercial contracts for deep tech founders in Europe? You need networks and places where you meet these customers in a highly efficient way. Yeah. So our approach to this was to say, we are building a network of 300 of the leading deep tech customers in Europe. Yeah, these are heads of R&D, heads of business units, as well as CVCs, CXOs of customers. So think about the Airbus ranks, Rheinmetalls, but as well Porsche, and all these large enterprise customers who procure external deep tech solutions. So what we just said is, hey, we bring 300 of these in one network, and you can access them at Deep Tech Momentum, and then literally accelerate your sales. It's very important to have senior people with budgets and problems on site. Yeah, it's kind of, you cannot imagine how effortful this is to get these people. It's such a pain. Yeah, so we have set up multiple call centers. Half of my team is doing cold calling. We've sent thousands of letters. We're reaching out via LinkedIn. It's extremely painful. But what we are doing there is literally we are creating shortcuts for founders. So you don't have to do this as your own. You just literally come and then meet them on site and meet 10 of them in a day. This is what we are doing. There are many others who do something similar. You know, for example, Hello Tomorrow as well. This is a competitor of ours. They're same place, same idea, or many other places where you can do this. But the idea of creating these networks for boosting commercial sales for deep tech founders is just a strong one, I think.
Martin, before we started the podcast, I asked you, are you EU funded, something like that? As much as I love the EU trying to help us create a more powerful innovation ecosystem in Europe, I think there are also some formats and some processes and rules that are not necessarily helping move us forward as rapidly as we could. Can you talk a bit about the decision to not be EU funded, to build this as a core machine of your own that doesn't tap into some of the larger scale programs that are being run by the public?
Yeah. Hey, look, so first, I believe in the power of the private sector, okay? In entrepreneurship in Europe, I do believe that entrepreneurship is one of the strongest force to move our continent forward. So you are an entrepreneur, I'm an entrepreneur, there are many others. You do a podcast for entrepreneurs. We are a force, but we need to join up more. And I think as well be more heard and be a bit more loud. I had a really interesting conversation with a leader of a supervisory board of one of the leading German corporates. And he told me, hey, Martin, when I was CEO, we just, for 20 years, just did our business. And we didn't care about politics. We looked down on the policymakers and the politics, we didn't really take it seriously. And we just made our business. And I think we can't afford this anymore. Yeah. Now, we as entrepreneurs and founders and operators, we need to engage more in the broader conversation. Because we're not heard enough. And I do think as well, we are now coming from several decades of regulation. We put layer on layer on top with good intent. You know, there's worker protection, there is data protection, and there is environmental protection, all good intents. But we put layer on layer of regulation on top that makes now entrepreneurship in Europe very, very difficult. I had last year Eric Schmidt on stage, former CEO of Google. He said, Europe has chosen not to grow. And I think he's right.
And then to double down on a point here, we need to not just ask for support, because we don't, like, what we need is not more public initiatives. We don't need more public money into the ecosystem. We need to get obstacles removed. The policymakers listen to founders to understand what it is that we need so that we can get the road paved, rather than we can get another place where we can apply for 50K or 200K or even $1 million. Like, as much as I love $1 million for something, I would wish that it would be driven towards the private sector, less heavy-handedly controlled by a corporate program that has its own agenda. Sorry, not corporate program, by public program that has some agenda, and just rather let the private markets run wild, and then we will probably see more innovation.
Yeah, Andreas, I think interestingly, we need in some parts of our ecosystem less state, as you say. In other parts, we need more state. Less state, of course, in regulation, and that just please give us our freedom back. We will earn the money, which we then together can all spend on infrastructure, education, defense, and more. But at the same time, the state can and should act as a customers. And you're saying very rightly, this is not about giving grants. This is about becoming customers. The US Department of Defense bought close to 70% of the semiconductors in the 60s in the US. And with this, literally created a market. The state has to act as well to create markets, in particular in deep tech. Think about space and defense. This is unthinkable without the state. Yeah, so that's as well a challenge for policymakers. On the one hand, you need to do less. On the other hand, you need to do more.
Yes, but please do more of the customer side, less of the grants and regulation side. Martin, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I'm so thankful for what you're building. I'm so thankful that someone who's done what you have in the past have dedicated yourself to this space. Thank you so much.
Andreas, there's a final thought which I would love to leave us with. We talked a bit about trust, and to get more trust in Europe, we need more courage. Yeah, this is a very important element. I do believe in the last decades, there's one quality that some of us have lost, and this is courage. It's courage to take personal risks. And we talked about VCs, about CVCs, about corporate as well, founders. This is the one quality we need to rediscover to build more trust and take the European deep tech ecosystem to a whole new level. So let's be courageous.
Yes, absolutely. European confidence is coming back in full speed. So thank you so much, Martin, for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Andreas. Big pleasure.